We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear about these things.
Well, hello and welcome to Planet Holyrood's Referendum Anniversary Special. I'm Paul Hutchin, political editor of the Daily Record, and I'm joined by the SNP MP Pete Wishart. Now, Pete, as well as being a former member of Runrig, is, I think, I hope he corrects me if I'm wrong, the longest serving Scottish MP, along with Alistair Carmichael of the Lib Dems. That's my memory of it anyway.
And you're absolutely spot on. We still have a little dispute about who was actually elected first. I was declared first, but according to Parliamentary Convention, apparently it's when you sign in, and Alistair was just a little bit ahead of the queue than me, so we probably have to give it to him.
Okay, well, we'll say joint first then. You've also written a book on the referendum called Inside the IndyRef, which I have to say I purchased and I enjoyed because it brought back a lot of memories, given that I covered the referendum for a different paper. So I was just wondering, Pete, what's the reaction been to the book?
I've been really pleasantly surprised at just how favourably it's been looked at. And I think most people who've had a look at it, like yourself, have quite enjoyed it. I mean, I've tried to make it as much a chronicle of what happened in the year leading up to the independence referendum, trying to capture the big events and give a little bit of a sense of what the twists and turns and ups and downs were like, particularly for us on the yes side. And there were many, as you could probably imagine, Paul, as we went through the course of that year. And I've tried to give as fair a representation as possible just about how all these things played out. And of course, it's a crescendo as we get to the end and to the Independence Day itself. 10 years, of course, and I really just hope that people enjoy it. If they don't, then just use it as some sort of reference point to what happened. I think it's the only book that's come out to mark 10 years, which has quite surprised me. I thought I would be one of many that would be coming out at this point, and so it's left the open market for me. So I'm quite happy about that.
Good stuff. So let's get into the guts of the book and one area of mutual interest, which is the vow. Now, if we go back to the referendum, 2 days before the referendum, the Daily Record published an iconic front page. It was signed by the three leaders of the UK parties, David Cameron for the Conservatives, Nick Clegg for the Lib Dems, and Ed Miliband for Labour, basically vowing or promising various things to the Scottish people, including more powers for the Scottish Parliament. So that was on the 16th of September, 2 days before the vote. And Pete, I'll just read an extract from your book on what you said the morning of the Record front page. So you said, "Today will go down in IndyRef history as the day of the vow. The front page of the Record reveals the last big move in the independence referendum, and it is it's a huge intervention. It is simply an incredible document, and it will have a massive impact on the last couple of days in the campaign." So 10 years on, do you think that front page by the Record did have an impact on the result or people's voting?
It's always difficult to try and assess just how big impact like that actually, and I think it's been disputed, just the effect that it had on the last couple of days. But there's no doubt in my mind that this was a big game-changing, significant event that was played out in the last couple of days, because throughout the whole of the year before, there was a big fight going on about who owned the change agenda, and quite naturally that was us. I mean, we were promising a new nation, a new independent nation. And throughout that campaign, the Better Together No side were always wrestling with this challenge of us as being the change agenda. And, they didn't get it right. I remember a couple of incidents and issues in the reference in my book about some of the difficulties they had trying to take that on. But that day they got it right. They got it absolutely and utterly right. They had an offer of change that, seemed to be quite hard to sort of contest and take on. It was the three leaders of the UK parties who were offering a significant agenda of ongoing changes as we went forward. And I've got no doubt that swayed quite a lot of people who, like the idea of something new, something different, something fresh that we were giving with a promise of independence, but at the same time, not quite bought into the whole independence agenda. And that filled a space. The vow filled a space in the last couple of days that was really hard for us to counter. There's one other thing about the vow I think is quite important. It wasn't supposed to come out on the Tuesday. The vow was apparently to be published on the Monday, and the only reason it didn't go ahead on the Monday was because David Haines, the Perth aid worker, was brutally executed by IS extremists on the Saturday evening leading into the Sunday morning. And I think there was a sense that to put something like that so overtly political on the Monday, the day after that happened, wouldn't have been right. So it was delayed to the Tuesday, which I actually think worked for the Those Better, because there was no chance whatsoever that we could respond to it.
So I disagree with you that it swayed voters. And, I look at the vow, and it was a superb piece of journalism, a great front page. It was impactful. When you work in a newspaper, you want your work spoken about. You want it to be shared and all the rest of it. And, to have the 3 UK leaders on the page making a pledge like that was, testament to the work of those journalists. But, my strong view is that people had made up their minds by that point. And if you look at some of the experts, I'll just read you a couple of the professors. John Curtis, he said that it's not clear the vow made much difference. And you've also got Professor James Mitchell, who we all know is an expert in the SNP. He said, a great deal is claimed about the vow, that it shifted opinion. We've had a look at this, and we simply can't find any evidence that it really had an impact. So I suppose my view is that great front page, superb journalism, but the referendum was already over at that point. People didn't change their minds in the last couple of days.
Yeah. See, I'm not entirely sure. There's been huge movement in the polls in the last couple of weeks, which was, I suppose, initiated by that dramatic poll that we had almost 10 days, 2 weeks out, where it showed that, yes, we're ahead by only 2 points, the famous Sunday Times poll that came out. And there was a lot of movement at that point, and obviously there was a lot of campaigning to try and catch the last of these votes. And I think there was still quite a lot of people who hadn't made up their mind right up to the very end. I remember on polling day itself being met with several people who were still asking me questions who still hadn't made up their mind. Now, I think it's right not to over-exaggerate and overstate the impact of the vow. And I've listened very carefully to what James and Ailsa Henderson's also said about all this, and there is evidence to show that it's not referenced as a point about people changing their minds. But I just think it had a big impact on about how people who hadn't made up their minds were thinking about the referendum, where they wanted things to get better and to change, but they didn't buy into the full powers of independence. And this just came along at that point and maybe just helped to further encourage them, shall we say, into perhaps not putting their X next to the referendum, the yes option.
See, I think of Alex Salmond's comments on the Indie Ref and trying to explain why yes falls short. And he puts a lot of store on the vow, not quite blaming the vow for the defeat, but it was a huge factor. And he said something similar a couple of weeks ago about another newspaper that we're not going to name, another tabloid. The failure of that paper to back yes in the campaign had a big impact as well. And just from where I'm sitting, the reason yes lost was the economic case for independence, things like currency. And when Alex Salmond starts to talk about the vow and newspapers not endorsing yes, it just seems like an element of back covering, that you can't quite take responsibility for the failures of the white paper, and that people just weren't willing to make that leap in the dark to independence. So he's falling back on something else entirely.
I mean, I know it's easy and convenient to blame something like the media coverage against the Yes campaign and to try and cite examples of the vow. And you're right, that had nothing to do with their defeat. We didn't address some of the main points and main themes and concerns that people had. We had the opportunity throughout the whole campaign to take that on constructively, positively, and give the answers that people required. And like our failure to get a yes vote is down to us. It's not down to anybody else or any external factors. But there was a changing mood in that last couple of weeks, and I continue to believe in assertiveness that there was things that were happening in the culture of the debate about the referendum that was having a big impact about how people were responding to the choices we were about to make. We failed, obviously, and I put that down to some of the things that happened in the summer to make the conclusive case why people should vote for independence. But there was a mood and an atmosphere in those last 2 weeks. It was quite febrile. You'll remember, Paul, some of the scenes that we observed about people, out in the streets participating in what I describe as almost like a carnival of politics. And so I think there was a number of external influences that were bearing upon that choice. There's not going to be one thing that decided the outcome of the independence referendum. The main reason that we did win is we did convince enough people of the case for independent Scotland, but there was a number of other things that were going on at the same time that were having a massive influence about how people were assessing how they should vote.
What I would say about the vow and its timing in terms of the unhelpfulness for the yes side was that in those last few days, you're competing for airtime, you're competing for column inches in the newspapers, you're wanting it to make your own positive case in those last 36 hours or whatever. And the vow definitely hogged that. There's no doubt that the focus was on that rather than the case for independence, because it shifted it onto more powers. But did it shift any votes? I'm deeply skeptical. As much as I would like to say that the record had this huge impact on the campaign, and I have to say, one of the ironic things about the vow is that it was the handiwork of the then editor Murray Foote, who is now the SNP chief executive. And I have to say, I haven't really heard Murray talk much about the vow over the last week. Do you think, is he maybe maintaining a vow of silence on this now?
Well, yeah, I think you'd really have to take that up with Murray, but there's so many ironies about the independence referendum, but that is a classic one. The guy that if I look back at the history of the vow, this is just my recollection, that I don't think it was a document that was drafted by the three-party leaders. My recollection, it was actually drafted by Murray and presented to the three-party leaders, and they thought this is actually works for us, and they put their name to it. Obviously, Gordon Brown had a massive impact about the direction and some of the language that was used around it. So that, I think that was it. But yes, I wouldn't be all that surprised if we don't hear Murray talking all that much about. I mean, I knew Murray during the course of the independence referendum campaign, and I had absolutely no idea that he actually was a yes supporter. So I suppose it's down to the cast iron discipline and your loyalty to your titles that, I never even got a whiff of the fact that Murray was an independent supporter during that time.
I just want to talk about the aftermath of the referendum and the vow, and then the Smith Commission, which delivered more powers for the Scottish Parliament, because there's quite a lot of bitterness on the SNP pro-independence side. There's a sort of narrative of betrayal, that the vow was promised and it wasn't delivered. So I'm going to pull it up. I'm not going to read out the entirety of the bloody thing, but I suppose the main aspect, there were three pledges, and the first one was that we are agreed that the Scottish Parliament is permanent and extensive new powers for the Parliament will be delivered by the process into the timetable agreed. I suppose my perspective is, by any argument, that was delivered, wasn't it? I mean, the Scottish Parliament did get extensive new powers.
Yeah, absolutely, and I don't think there's any argument about that. I mean, one of the first things that the new government did was bring forward the conclusions of the Smith Commission, and it was one of the biggest transfer of powers that we've ever seen in the history of devolution. New tax powers, new welfare powers, and I don't think there's any question whatsoever that part of the vow was pretty neatly fulfilled. But I think what was missing was the huge expectation that had been built up, particularly around the last few weeks of the independence referendum campaign. We actually believed, and I actually believed at that point, that we were going to be in a situation which was going to be akin to near federalism. This was the language that was used and the heightened expectations that sort of went forward. Now, we did get more powers, yes, and I think that it's been to Scotland's advantage and benefit that they were delivered, but it was nothing like what we presumed that we were going to get. And I put this down to Gordon Brown, the way that he sold this case in the way that he described this new promised land of the most powerful devolved parliament in the world, a near federalism that would be unprecedented anywhere in the world. And of course, there was nothing like that. New powers welcome, yes, but did it match the rhetoric that was kicking around at that point? Absolutely not.
Aye, but I mean that phrase neo-federalism, that wasn't in the vow. I mean that didn't make it into the final text. Is there not an element by some pro-independent supporters of they're trying to tarnish the vow in the Smith Commission by comparing it to a phrase by Gordon Brown during the campaign?
Well, you see, if you actually look at the vow, I think there's only about 220 odd words which are included in the vow, and it doesn't actually say all that much. It just put forward a few commitments. There was no document that accompanied and followed up. There was no like glossy magazine which was going to explain what all these new powers were going to be. So like we were left, like when we were assessing what the vow actually meant by some of the words that were accompanying it. Now, Gordon Brown in the last few weeks sort of overtook Alistair Darling as the leader of the No campaign, and he was practically writing Conservative policy on the hoof, which was almost unprecedented for somebody who had just been booted out of government just a few years previously. So we had to try and get a point about what do they mean by this? I mean, it was all written there, but like if you look at it, it's just, it is, for all its eloquent prose and dramatic impact, it doesn't say very clearly what's intended. So we were looking at some of the accompanying statements by those that were championing it, and that was an impression. Certainly, it's what I got. And you know, I mean, I know Alec took a different view. He didn't believe it for a minute, and that was the feet to the fire sort of stuff that came out from Alec subsequently. Yeah, but I thought they might have been serious. What I expected, Paul, was full fiscal autonomy, an attempt to look at a federalism across the United Kingdom, whether that would be an internation federalism or a federalism involved, you know, like some of the inputs, some of the larger regions in England. But it just, they weren't even curious about building that case, about looking at the possibilities of all that. That was quite limited and restricted to taxation.
Were you really expecting full fiscal autonomy to come from the vow and the referendum? I mean, I just can't remember that even being on the agenda for a second.
Well, probably not expected would be too, but I thought there would have been more of a positive conversation, discussion about it, but it was completely taken off the table. Now, what I remember about the Scotland bill that followed the Smith Commission is it was just after we had a massive success in the 2015 election, and it was me that took through most of the Scotland Acts in the last decade. I think it was 3 Scotland Acts leading up to the one in 2015, and all our MPs were relatively new, so it was left to sort of me and Angus Robertson to take this through. And I remember we produced a number of amendments on various other powers that we felt could be usefully devolved, some of the things that had gone in the Smith Commission that had been overlooked, and we brought forward a full fiscal autonomy plan. All of our amendments were rejected without really even the proper consideration. And we thought we'd have been in an environment at that point after the No case winning and like a new government coming in to have a look at this, but there was no interest whatsoever in going anywhere beyond what was exclusively agreed in the Smith Commission.
I mean, I feel like the SNP can be accused of muddled messages on this, because I mean, what was promised was extensive new powers, and what we got in the end was effectively all of income tax devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and social security became like a shared power. And if you look at the way that those powers have been used since they were devolved, you know, we've got a progressive tax system, more progressive than it is south of the border. And I think by any token, the best, most effective poverty that the SNP have introduced in the last decade is the Scottish Child Payment, which came from the vow, which then flowed from the Smith Commission. So isn't there a case that you should actually be embracing, you know, the fact that this agreement came out of the referendum? You got some decent powers for the Parliament, and you've used them to good effect in some cases.
I think that's fair, and you know, I don't think you'll find any sort of quibble at all from anybody in the Scottish National Party about the devolution of further taxation powers. And you're right, I think we've been able to use them to demonstrate the type of Scotland that we would want to construct, whether that's a more progressive taxation regime or the creation of something like the Scottish Child Payment. So like there is no issue about all that. But I think in response to that, I would sort of say that because we have that one fiscal lever, that somehow Scotland is in charge of all its fiscal arrangements, which clearly isn't the case. We could make better use of our powers and abilities over income tax, but we haven't got anything else which really helps us and helps the Scottish economy. So I think it's convenient for quite a lot of commentators just to say that we could do this, we could do that, we could respond to this, we could mitigate that, we could do that, which we can't, because like we're pretty limited to that. And on welfare powers, I remember this very carefully, clearly about all this. We initially got devolution over some of the more disability-related benefits, which really didn't make all that much difference in terms of how we approached it. We were able to do a number of things, and I think we demonstrated a new philosophy which talked about support rather than welfare. But I mean, if we look at it in the round, it was a significant devolution of powers, and I'm not going to contradict it, but was it enough to sort of make that real difference to our abilities to bring forward policies that we wanted? I'm not entirely sure that's the case.
Just final point on the vow, Pete. I suppose my view is that some folk like Alex Salmond, they focus on the vow. They say that was the game changer, that was the defining moment. And then there's this narrative of maybe betrayal, maybe that's a bit too harsh, that people were promised powers that they didn't get. When people in the independence movement focus on these things, is this not a distraction from focusing on the real reasons for why Yes fell short? Is it not just like a convenient comfort blanket, effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in that. I think people look for particular episodes that they could blame or interventions that could sort of excuse our defeat. And we shouldn't be doing that. We should be looking long and hard at ourselves about why we failed to convince the majority of our fellow Scots. But I think it's also legitimate to sort of pick up some of the language and rhetoric that was going around at that point. And I think when people refer to, I'll never use the word betrayal when it comes to this, but disappointment, shall we say, in what was actually on offer, I think if that was measured up to the rhetoric that we heard previously, I think people are probably entitled to feel that this is not what they felt that they were promised, and this is not what they felt that they were going to secure by all the things that were said in advance.
Okay, well, we respectfully agree to disagree on that one, but that's good. Just more broadly on the book, I was struck how much you enjoyed the campaign, being out on the stump, talking to people, just the whole. I mean, obviously there were elements of it that made you feel uncomfortable, but by and large, you thought it was a positive experience. What would you say to folk on the no side, even though they were on the winning side, that they felt like it was not a positive moment for Scotland, that they felt that some of the pro-independent supporters were too aggressive, particularly online and then on the streets as well, and they look back on the referendum with a sense of dread and anxiety?
Yeah, and I think they've probably got a case. I mean, like when I talk about the excitement and drama of the independence referendum, you've got to remember that this book is based on my diary, so it's real-time coverage, and I'm trying to sort of reflect upon some of the things that were happening in the mood and what it felt like for us. And yes, I think we were starting to become aware of some of the problems and issues that those colleagues on the no side were starting to experience throughout the campaign. And I make a couple of references to that. Because I think it's only subsequently, and at the point where we're able to look back on it, we could realise and understand, like how unpositive it was, how negative it was for those that were on the no sides. And I think some of the stuff wasn't acceptable. And I think that if we have to do this again, we have to get to a better place where there's more respect and understanding of each other's case. And I think we've got to have a space where points of view could be expressed without any sort of fear of being set upon or piled on. you've got to remember that the independence referendum occurred just at the point where social media was getting into full swing. Like it was only really an innovation of 2-3 years, and I think the independence referendum was the first real test about how all this was going to work. So it was a medium that we were getting used to. It didn't get to this stage of being finessed. Arguments were being presented and portrayed without any real self-censorship or self-editing. And I think a lot of that, but I'll say another thing about this, and you'll probably take me up on this, the press did everything possible to like build and invent this folk demon of the cybernet. And I say in my book, and I'll stand by this, that a lot of that was to try and silence. We had no press support in the independence referendum. There was very few columnists or journalists who would express a support.
Sunday Herald backed, yes, I have to say.
And absolutely, that came probably about 3 months, 4 months out of the independence referendum. But up to that point, there was nothing, and there was no commentators that were prepared to say that they supported. So all we had was independent media, and particularly social media, where we were able to sort of build a case, put it forward, transmit information, direct people to more positive examples of what independence can do. And I don't blame the Unionist press for trying to shut that down and trying to ensure that that wasn't going to be available, and there was an issue and a problem with this. And that's where the invention of the cybernet sort of came down. There were people who behaved appallingly online on the yes side. And again, I reference that in my book, but it was a pretty good attempt by the press to try and close that down. And I don't
think it was an invention, though. I mean, I remember, there were some horrible people on the pro-independence side online. Now, I have noticed in the last few years more balancing of that, a preponderance of Union Jack avatars. But my experience of 2013, 2014, as I say, I worked for the Sunday Herald, was that most of the aggression, unpleasantness, and nastiness came from the pro-independence side.
Yeah, that's because that was all we had was independent sites, blogs, social media. We didn't have the voice of the mainstream media. I mean, that was almost exclusively the voice of the No campaign. So if you're going to find problems and difficulties, particularly with a new medium and people who are probably using it who haven't got the journalistic skills of Paul Hutchin, you're going to find difficulties and problems with that. So I'm not surprised that's the case, but you've got to remember that was all we had to trade in at that point. And some of the voices on that weren't the polished voices of the mainstream media. There were people who were sitting with a keyboard and got particularly angry and frustrated, and some of that came across, and some of it was terrible. And I'm the first to say it. And, again, I reference a couple of examples in the book about how that was negative for us. We spent a lot of our campaign time and energy trying to sort of respond to some of the claims of the press about the cybernets. The Daily Mail, for example, I think featured a cybernet story about every second or third day. And a lot of our time was taken up with responding to that, where we could have been out positively campaigning about what an independent Scotland could deliver.
I just want to read you another extract from your book, this time on the white paper, which I thought was fascinating. And it was on the content of the white paper in relation to broadcasting and the future of the BBC. If you remember, I think the proposal was for a separate Scottish Broadcasting Corporation, but it didn't go into too much detail. And you write that my very strong view is that if we set up a distinct Scottish Broadcasting Corporation separate from the BBC, it would be only too easy for the Unionists to assert that we wouldn't secure programmes like EastEnders and Strictly. I made my views known on this, and it seemed that Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary, agreed. So just to go back to that, I mean, what was your preference then, and what did you think that the white paper should have said on the future of broadcasting in the BBC?
Well, I'd spent a lot of time as a sort of DCMS spokesperson dealing with issues like broadcasting and speaking to the big events in Scotland and UK. My view was that it should have been a shared service, and that's what I made clear, and that's what the excerpt you refer to as my view about how this should be taken forward. And I think, had we done anything else, we would have been susceptible to the claim that, Scottish viewers wouldn't be able to get the programmes they enjoyed and what they were used to. And, even though the example of Ireland would clearly show that's not the case, but at that point, the BBC was a really hot independence referendum issue, and a number of claims were getting made about what Scotland would be deprived of if we did have our own broadcaster. That's why I felt just to resolve that and get it out of the way, that we should continue to have a shared BBC. I'm somebody who's a big fan of the BBC, and I think that BBC Scotland operates pretty effectively as a standalone service. And I think we could have creatively come together to an arrangement that would have ensured that we would have got a BBC service across the whole of what would be the islands of Great Britain. I'm not sure. I mean, I've read the white paper excerpt, obviously, and that was not the plan that was put forward. But I think that where we are just now, and had that come to pass, we probably would have been resolved some of the issues. But I just felt that was a convenient way to deal with some of the difficulties we're encountering about BBC services.
Yeah, so you say that your preference would have been for a shared service. Is that still your view?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I think we were to do this again, that would be what I would be advocating. I think there's 10 years on, there's probably more of a case, and I think we could look at international examples about how distinct and separate BBC services when it comes to national broadcasters could work. And we've looked at the example of Ireland and Denmark in particular over the last 10 years, but it has some fantastic output. And of course, we're in a different position now with the proliferation of satellite broadcasting, your Netflix, Amazons, etc. So, we'd have to relook at all of this again, but it's entirely different where it was from 2014. But, there is something distinctive and specific about the BBC that is good, and which is the envy of the world. Everywhere I went to talk about television and services, the BBC was always put forward as an example of something that works very, very well.
And it's linked to another bit of the book where you're quite sensitive to people's sense of Britishness and their British identity. And I sense from the book that you felt like maybe the Yes campaign never quite got to grips with that. I think at one point you even described yourself as a royalist.
Yes. Well, I'm one of the few members of Parliament that's on the royalist wing of the Scottish National Party. I just think it's something that works. And certainly during the independence referendum, any suggestion that we would become a republic would have turned people off immediately. But I was always somebody who was prepared to look at a number of shared facilities, shared resources, shared services. And one of the things that I came across was particularly the older generation, the one demographic that we disastrously failed with, and there's no getting away from it. We did so badly with older people, and one of the reasons that we didn't get to them is we didn't properly understand what they wanted, and we failed to appreciate the depth of their cultural Britishness. This was a generation that were post-war, that had seen the emergence of the new United Kingdom after war, the NHS being created, all the welfare state being built, and they bought into that as an agenda, and that was reflected in their sense of feeling British. Now, I think there was a case that we had as an independence organisation and movement that we could start to encroach a little bit into this and to give that demographic something to invest in an independent Scotland. I even went as far, Paul, I think, as you'll remember, to say that, independence could actually help Britishness, because what would we do would be creating a new Britishness out of two independent countries, and there wouldn't be a sense or feeling that one was being imposed upon the other, and give an opportunity, because, as we all know, the sense and idea of Britishness is pretty much in decline, but it's not amongst the older generation. And we just failed to understand them properly about what they were bringing to the conversation about Scottish independence. And that was why I made probably a clumsy attempt to try and enlist and enroll that into being a positive force for Scottish independence.
Imagine Scotland does become independent one day. Are there any other institutions apart from the BBC that you think it would be wise to operate on a shared and pooled basis?
Well, Alex Salmond made a really important speech early on in the independence referendum, and he said, I can't remember what there was the 5 unions that Scotland is in, the rest of the United Kingdom, and I think he referred to the social union, defence, like the European Union. The only union that we sought to sever was the political union with the United Kingdom. That was the one thing that the independence campaign was all around. And it was a really important speech by Alec, and I remember listening to it thinking, that is totally spot on. I mean, I don't think we expressed that enough and I don't think we managed to sort of put the case. That was the only thing that we were actually seeking to resolve and remove ourselves from, was the political union. All the other ones, like we've shared these islands for over 300 years. We've built up a sort of reservoir of cultural attachment. We've done things together, and like we should have done more to build the case that we were going to continue to share that. That like being British, for example, was just as much my entitlement than the most rabid unionists from the southeast of England. But we got a little bit nervous about getting into that particular discussion. But possibly,
do you feel British as well as Scottish?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm British, but the fact that I live in the island of Great Britain within the British Isles, and there's a connection historically, culturally, that shapes my view of the world, which is related and rooted in the fact that I've been in this social and political union for 300 years. So everybody's got a Britishness, whether they recognise it or not, whether they want to sort of do something about it and make sure it's not going to be a feature of their personality or outlook. That's a matter for them. But yes, it's part of who we all are, and it's part of and I think older people, particularly during the independence referendum, felt that more keenly, and we weren't able to sort of like bring that on board and make more of a feature and try and address some of the concerns around it.
One final subject, Pete. Alex Salmond. Now, in your book, there's a very deft description of him, delicately written, I would say, and you describe him as a complex but flawed man. Now, so much has been written about the relationship between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, but you've known him for decades as well. You were at Westminster with him. I think maybe you were his chief whip as well. Is that correct? Yeah. How do you feel about him in 2024?
I mean, Alec came to my select committee a few weeks ago, just before the dissolution of Parliament, and I listened to Alec that day, and he was fantastic. It was vintage Alec, dominating the committee, addressing his agenda and his thoughts, making mincemeat of Douglas Ross, which was actually quite funny. And I was just thinking, we've lost that. We've lost this elder statesman who is able to come in situations like this and just tell it how it is and be reflective and like use the whole history of experience and background and understanding about some of the issues. And I really, really despaired that we lost that resource and facility, and I really wish there was some way that we could hold on to it. I think it's too far gone, Paul. I think that relationship breakdowns are pretty hard to put together, and there's no doubt that that's the case. I've watched the programme, and I could sense that there's very little chance of getting back together again. Now, I'm an advocate of independence convention, a constitutional convention, to take us forward in all this, and I was hoping that if we were able to create that, there would be some sort of space that some of these discussions and debates could take place to see if there was any sort of joint way forward. It wouldn't mean people giving up like deeply held views about personalities or whatever, but like just a space where we could work. And I think that I continue to believe that's the best approach now for the independence movement, is to try and get this back. And then if we could do that, maybe get back to some of the energy and excitement that's there in my book, but it's a long way to go.
I mean, I look at Alec's first spell as leader when he professionalised the SNP, dragged the SNP into the television age, and then his second spell as leader, where he took them to government for the first time, had a pretty successful first term, managed to secure the referendum. And then I look at the post-2015 version of Alec, and it just seems like a disaster zone. The Russia Today debacle. There's not an element of him just as this sort of tragic waste of talent in terms of the last 10 years.
I think that's you could have put it any better, yes, and it is, and like we've been used, and we just can't understand what motivates some of these decisions and manoeuvrings of the new reincarnated contemporary Alex Salmond. Because you're right, he had a political instinct that was almost unsurpassed. Nobody was able to sort of look at a situation and determine a way forward better than Alex Salmond, and he was able to display that, demonstrate that throughout the whole independence referendum experience. He made a number of mistakes that, again, highlight the first disastrous debate and some of the stuff around Putin, didn't play out well at all. But like, he had such a deft hand, and I think that we look at what he's doing in Alba just now, and we think, what on earth is this all about? And why on earth are you actually continued to prosecute this? Alex said at 2% in the polls. The Alex Salmond of 2001 or 2013, 2014 would be aghast at that and probably just conclude that there's no point in continuing. But for some reason, Alec does.
That's great, Pete. Well, listen, thanks very much for coming on Planet Holyrood. I really appreciate it. As I say, I enjoyed the book. I would recommend it to anyone who wants to learn about one of the most momentous periods in Scottish history. The next Planet Holyrood will be on Thursday afternoon, and I hope that everyone will join us again. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Paul.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear about these things.